gonna do this together.
Haven't you been dreaming about adventure?
She was always chasing after some far-fetched idea. There's no such thing as curses.
Everything that you see wants to kill you, and can. Do you want to turn back?
Nope, just getting started.
Your filmography is quite impressive. Your most recent work, of course, being the underwater director of photography for Jungle Cruise, which we'll discuss in more detail. But you've also worked with M. Night Shyamalan for Old, Zack Snyder, Army of the Dead, and Justice League, Pirates, Cabin in the Woods, some of my favorite films that have come out in recent years. And so I hate to start in a general fashion because I'm excited to talk about the filmmaking details, but what led you down this path, and what is it about underwater photography that excites you and is fun to explore?
Well, I got into it probably, in the late 80s when I got certified on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And I rented a camera they had camera rentals there, just a still camera. And I was already into photography, developing in the darkroom negatives and doing my own developing and stuff like that. So mostly black and white. So I was interested in, I didn't know anybody who did it, and there's not a lot of books. There was certainly no school you could go to. So it was a lot of trial and error. But over the years, I got more developed at it, I guess. And that interest kept, at the same time, I was also in the film industry, and I would always pay attention to, when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of Disney nature programs, documentaries, so on and so forth, James Bond movies, Thunderball. You always try to hold your breath for as long as you can in some of these, some of these films, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this kind of stuff. So I was super interested in it, and it was always you could always find some general nomenclature about other surface work, or the making of Gone with the Wind, but you could never really find too much stuff about any of the underwater stuff. So that part of it kind of intrigued me. I was a diver and a photographer before I became a cinematographer. So I did have that photographic background before I got into it. And so a large portion of, Cabin in the Woods was shot on film. It wasn't digital. We weren't really doing digital pictures at that point. So I did a fair amount of work, cinematography, underwater cinematography on motion picture film, which, the underwater still photography really did aid in allowing me to understand exposure and shutter and composition, and not necessarily composition, but just the mechanics of the camera itself, as far as film developing, your printing lights and all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, most of it is digital. So then the cameras seem to change every 6 months, but we got to shoot film on Old, the M. Night Shyamalan picture, and I loved shooting film again. It was fantastic. It doesn't always happen because I guess it's a director specific request, like Christopher Nolan, and I know Zach likes to shoot on film, Zack Snyder, but Army of the Dead was shot. There wasn't any underwater on that. I just shot the second unit on that film, but that was shot with red cameras. So that was his first. I think it was his first digital capture film that was entirely not film. Motion picture film. So, I think for me, I was just obsessed with underwater imagery, be it still or motion picture. And I kept my interest levels up, and they're still there today. So obviously it really, I think it is beneficial to whatever discipline you're going after, if it's aerial photography or production design or artwork, whatever, that you just stay passionate about it. So.
Yeah. So I mentioned some of the films that you've been a part of, and you mentioned a few there as well. What's your mindset and approach going into something that may have a psychedelic tone, something like Under the Silver Lake, compared to something that is grounded in reality or has an elevated reality, fantasy, if you will? These sequences, you may convey different feelings when you stack them all next to each other. Yeah. Like there's a feeling of for instance, in Jungle Cruise, there's a feeling of uncertainty and fear in the sequence that's underwater in that film.
Yeah, I think, it would all bow down to whatever the story is and whatever the story requires. And then after that, it's whatever the director wants, whatever flavor the director wants. So, but I mean, each time before the camera rolls, you've got the four corners of the frame. There are a plethora of influences that I have that anybody would have. But for me, it's all personal, right? So I have my influences that have been important and major in my life over the years, and they come from other films, they come from music, they come from art, they come from photography. So all that is swirling around in your head before you actually roll. And it just depends. Under the Silver Lake was, the director was very maniacal about the frame being centered. He didn't want like short sighting. He wanted everything to be flat and level. Mm-hmm. Stanley Kubrick also worked that way. So Jungle Cruise is a big summer blockbuster movie. There's a certain flavor that you got to bring to it. There's a certain look that it's going to have. Under the Silver Lake is not that kind of a film. Mm-hmm. Cabin in the Woods, it's it was a unique film because it was a tongue-in-cheek horror picture and really interesting. It was very well written. Yeah. When you work with certain directors, they're gonna demand different things from you, or if they have a certain style, all their films look the same way. You have to fall into that. You have to adapt to whatever their style is.
Yeah. So you mentioned kind of plugging into some of those influential materials, whether it's music, art, or other films. How much of the process, I guess it kind of varies from film to film, but how much of the process are you typically invited in on? Do you familiarize yourself with a lot of the filmmakers' work to make sure there are subtle continuities with your footage and the rest of the film's footage?
Yeah, I typically, once I get contacted, I've worked with Night twice now, and on Jungle Cruise, that was basically, you just had to, I guess, go back to any of the blockbuster summer movies that they've done. I don't think they were going for anything different with regards to that. Cabin in the Woods, or Pathfinder, or I've worked with Zach 3 or 4 times now. Mm-hmm. I kind of know what his palette is, what he's looking for. And so it's just basically studying what I'll review a couple of the films that they've done before I have an interview, or before we, if there's no interview, if it's just like, we need you for this and booth, I'll for sure do my research before I arrive so that I'm prepared.
You hinted at a few of these things, but I kind of wanted to explore some of your underwater filming techniques through Jungle Cruise a little bit more. So obviously there's that big scene in the film where Dwayne Johnson and Emily Blunt's characters have to solve this centuries-old puzzle, which involves them going underwater. I have a pretty good sense of everything that's involved with cinematography on the surface, but imagining a camera underwater, how light shines through, reflects in that space, and how that space challenges movement, not just for your equipment, but the actors as well, with their hair and everything. It's foreign territory to me. So I would love to know more about the creative and collaborative process of filming a sequence like the one that's in Jungle Cruise. Like, what goes into the preparation of it and the execution of it?
Well, definitely that set, which was in a tank, there has to be enough room in the tank for not only the set, but the performers, and also the consideration for the camera. Sometimes when production design does not incorporate that, a lot of times, on a dry set, you'd have walls that can fly. They can remove the walls to get the camera where normally they wouldn't be able to unless they're shooting in a practical location. So a lot of that is factored in, but sometimes it's not. I've worked on a few jobs where the production design did not incorporate that, and you had to work around like hard, solid objects that you could not. That's exactly where they wanted the camera, and well, like there's something there, I can't get it there. So as far as Jungle Cruise is concerned, that set was constructed outside of the tank, and then it was placed in. It usually needs a couple of days to settle and get all the air bubbles out of it. And the materials that they're using also have to take some time to settle. And so there's a clarifying process whereby the materials have to adapt to the water. Mm-hmm. And then just as far as that sequence, it would have been usually gone over with stunt personnel and the camera department. We go in and we kind of do a general rehearsal so that the talent will have a general idea. Sometimes we video the rehearsals. That's quite common, so that the talent can look at what the sequence is going to entail, what they're going to have to do, what, you know, the stunt people have got all the hazards out of the way, or they're making the talent aware of what the hazards would be. And everything moves a bit slower. I'm not saying that it's a slow process, but it just means that you can't force yourself through that water as fast as you can, as fast as you think you can on land. A general misconception is everyone usually says, "Oh, well, I got certified in Hawaii. I know how to dive. I'm good." But on the day, it's usually a different picture. So sometimes there is training that happens prior, but usually depending on the schedule, the stunt personnel, or there'll be a safety diver attached to that cast member. They'll make sure that they're comfortable and familiar with diving, or actually it's not necessarily diving. It's just basically a lot of the time it's holding their breath and being comfortable in the water. And some people are, and some people are not. So, and as far as the actual environment, I mean, the water has to, it's the best, the rule of thumb is to have the most clear water possible. And that in tank environments, that's controlled by filtration and chemicals. In the open ocean, you've got no control over it. I mean, basically if a storm comes in and silts everything up, the next day you need a couple of days for that to clear. So you can't shoot, or you're going to scout some other place on the island where visibility wasn't so hard hit. But like when we did Batman versus Superman, we shot in Bora Bora, which subbed for the Indian Ocean, and that water clarity was quite amazing. It was great. We had a smaller cove. It was in a coral atoll where there's not a lot of waves coming in. It was kind of a protected area, so we were able to get some fish in there. So I mean, where you shoot is important. The light, if you're using natural sunlight, where the sun's going to be at a certain time, how much time you have to shoot. I've done commercials in cenotes in Mexico where we had a shooting window between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. because after that, as the sun, as the sun's, as the Earth's rotating, as the sun's moving, the hole is only so big, and then the sun's gone, and then that's it. That's your shooting window. So, but on a set like Jungle Cruise, it would have been artificial light, and which is easier to manipulate, control the light that way anyway. And then I would augment with underwater fixtures. I'd say most of the time I try to go for a more naturalistic look as opposed to having light that is coming from below, which is unnatural. So I've been asked sometimes to do stuff like, akin to like an aurora borealis, but a reverse aurora borealis where the light is coming from below. In any kind of fantasy film, that's fine, but in reality, I would probably have a hard time swallowing that. But it's you're there to contribute to the film, and you're there to solidify the director's what they want, their vision per se, and so you've got to do what they want you to do, whether or not it's unrealistic or not.
What interested me the most is when you were talking about like when you have a sequence that may be more fantasy based and you're using light that may be more unnatural. Is that more fun for you because it's allowing you to pick at something that's more creative instead of have a moment that feels as natural as possible, so the audience doesn't feel, or so the audience feels like, oh, this is what it's like to be in that space, instead of something that may challenge your feelings and emotions a little bit through lighting or positioning?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when you have a creative lighting setup, that is always very interesting, and that's always it's taxing, but it ends up being a challenge, and it's a lot, it's a lot more interesting than for sure than just going underwater and just shooting natural light. I think both are interesting, but I think that it's obviously a bit more challenging. I mean, on Jungle Cruise, I had to light, which is quite common. I had to light blue screen or green screen, depending on whatever the color that the effects supervisor wants to use. And anybody who shoots underwater, who's an underwater DP, has had to do this. So. And I usually get a lot of comments from Visifex Supers that the screens that I light are evenly lit. There's no shadow spaces, which just makes their job easier. So I try to tend to make it not, perfect, but I try to make it very even, the light. So that's one thing we have to work on for sure. It's one thing we did work on for Jungle Cruise. So the lighting design is based around that. How are you going to light that without it lighting the set? How is it going to not light the actors if you don't want that light to hit them as well? So these are all challenges that you have to engage in. And then something that's a little bit more fantasy based. There are some new LED fixtures that are on the market right now that have different colors and different frequencies and different firing sequences, and that gets really interesting. I mean, I've seen some interesting stuff on music videos where they've had different interactive lighting going on. We did interactive lighting on Man of Steel, but in the beginning, when Russell Crowe is swimming through the Codex chamber, the initial plan, I think, was to have him stationary and to have the lighting move around him. But as far as the safety concerned, that was not the way to do it. So we had to come up with an interactive light where he could swim through it as well. Anytime you're trying to tether any talent, that's going to require them to be very comfortable with that. But then you need serious bailout systems if it all goes wrong, or because everything can be in place and then they can tilt back and get water up their nose, and then they want to get out and then they can't move. So, my primary, straying off topic slightly, but my primary concern when we do any of this stuff is the safety of the talent in the water. And I've worked with a variety of different performers whose skill level is as wide and varied as their disciplines are. So Charlize Theron for sure is someone who I've worked with a couple of times, who's very, very comfortable and very good in the water. Tommy Lee Jones was great. Ryan Reynolds is excellent. And Dwayne and Emily were both very comfortable in the water. And so, it can be, you can get one take out of a shot if the talent is not comfortable. As soon as they go down, they're like, not doing this. And that's the only take you're going to get with them. So a lot of times it's quite common that the first take everything has to be perfect, because if they're never going to get in the water again, you're never going to get the chance to do that again. So a lot of pressure sometimes.
I bet. So I imagine that communication with the director or the director of photography is through like a headset. So, like, okay, we got what we need, or do they leave that to you to kind of ultimately decide? What is that like?
They have a surface feed, which I have a video link from my housing to the surface, which is hardwired. And I have an underwater speaker, a loudspeaker in the water. So they're watching at a monitor and they have what appears to be like a CB radio or a microphone that they can speak. And so everyone in the water can hear. But I typically don't use headsets or helmet devices. I have used them, but I find I think it's production dependent. I typically don't always use them. So basically, it's a one system. The director will speak, or the assistant director will speak. Everyone in the water can hear, and then I'll nod the camera or I'll shake the camera no. So we all work these signals out before so that they don't go, what's that mean? I find it's a more efficient. It's obviously a director's fantasy that they get to speak and no one gets to answer back, but I think it's an efficient communication because oftentimes when talent gets in the water, they can't hear or they're concentrating on something else, not drowning. Yeah. And, or if they're exhaling with regulator, the bubbles that go in your ears, you can't hear. So I usually, before we do this work, I always say, keep your words to a minimum and just be concise and repeat yourself, like say it twice. So that they can, oftentimes they won't hear you the first time. And often what will happen is if the talent's in the water and they're getting set up, I'll aim the camera at them so that the director and the surface people can look and say, okay, they're not comfortable, or they're not ready, their hair is blowing everywhere, and when you mentioned hair earlier, it depends on the job. But if it's supposed to be a lake with current, or a river with current, or an ocean with current, but we're shooting in a tank, sometimes we'll use other devices like fans or scooters and stuff to create this sort of aura that the hair is moving instead of it just sitting there. I mean, basically, if anyone's kind of just moves himself back and forth, your hair will do that naturally, depending on how long your hair is. So yeah, these are other considerations to make it seem like you're still in the ocean when you're not, maybe. So.
Yeah, gotcha. Earlier you had mentioned working with the visual effects supervisor. So for something that happens in Jungle Cruise, like Dwayne Johnson being attacked by piranhas, what does that environment look like for you to convey that feeling that they're actually there?
Well, that was done against a composite screen, and of course the piranhas were digital, but you still have to. Sometimes they'll say, they come in from the left. Maybe there's an animated pattern as to how they're going to do it. Sometimes they don't map that stuff out as far as vis effects, as far as the route that the fish are taking or whatever the object is. Oftentimes, if there's computer generated pre-visualization, which is basically a computer animated animatic that is it's like a moving storyboard, and sometimes that's already mapped out. They know how fast the shot's going to be, how fast whatever the creature or piranhas or whatever are going to be moving. Sometimes they already know that, so you have to match what that animatic is doing. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes they don't have a plan; they put it in later. So how you move the camera, and I usually ask that question. It's like, how many are coming, and what do you want to make it look like? So we'll do a couple different speeds, and that way it gives them different options. They say, well, this faster one's too fast, or whatever. We'll go with the slower one. So, but with that shot, I mean, Dwayne just got in, and he got in the water, and he just pretended like he was being attacked by fish, and then they put it all in later. So,
what would you say is the work that you're most proud of?
It's called Pathfinder. It was a biking thing with Carl Urban, but we did, there's some really interesting work we did on that picture. The film is horrible, so I don't know if I can say it. It's I'm very proud. I mean, I can say I'm proud of the work I did on it, but I mean, I wouldn't actually say, yeah, that film. I did some stuff. There's some recent projects that I've done. The experience working on the Thai cave rescue picture with the directors who won the Oscar for Free Solo, mm-hmm. Chai Vasarhelyi and Jimmy Chin. It was wonderful to work with them. We shot in the UK for a couple of months, and I just felt like we were working with the real divers who did the rescue for that when that happened, and it was something else being in the water with them and watching them work and figuring all that stuff out. So I don't know that I probably have a favorite, but I think it's difficult to pick them all out. They're all so different, they're all varied, which is good. I mean, it's a good thing that they're not all the same, right? So yeah.
So speaking of differences, obviously there's, I imagine, M. Night Shyamalan's approach, like with Old, for instance. When you watch Old, you see parts of the characters' faces in the film that kind of allow your imagination to go wild, and the reveals happen whenever it feels most natural for the characters. But then when as you mentioned earlier with David Robert Mitchell with Under the Silver Lake, he wants things centered. So there's all these different techniques and approaches to how they want the camera to be framed. But is there any interesting commonalities between all the filmmakers that you've worked with?
Some of them have not done a lot of underwater work. When I worked on Tully, Jason Reitman had not ever done anything underwater. So we had to have separate meetings to discuss the process so that he could understand it and so that he wouldn't be frustrated when he didn't understand what was happening. Night, he's very specific about what he wants. You can study all the movies you want, but then when you work with him, he's very specific. And some directors are not specific at all. They just say, just go in there and show me something.
Mm-hmm.
And then so by them seeing it, they will understand the process, or they will generate something that will, and a lot of times it's, like I said, there's sometimes a storyboard, sometimes an animatic. It's usually just, I usually think of those things as rough, loose guides, unless it is extremely specific. I think it's not great to be pigeonholed or pushed into a corner and like, this is the only thing you're doing. Then you almost become, robotic with what you're doing.
Sure.
As long as you have some creativity and you're bringing something to the project. I think they feed off that when they see your enthusiasm, or you're pushing it beyond what they thought they could get. Cabin in the Woods, that whole sequence was done the very last day. I think it was, I don't know, everybody had been working nights and nobody wanted to be there. And we did that. It was done very fast. And I think at the end of the when the show is wrapped and we're finished, or the day is wrapped or whatever, I usually try to put the camera down and swim up and shake the hands of the directors, of the DP or whoever. And on that show, everybody they all had planes together. As soon as they practically called rap, and I didn't even know they'd called rap. It's very common, but you come up and there's nobody there. You're like, well, I guess they all left. So, but then, they got what they wanted, but they just out the door. But yeah, every show is different.
Which of the films that you've been a part of, that you worked on, are you like most excited to share, where like the film itself, the narrative itself is something that is exciting to explore and talk about with whoever you're with?
Well, certainly, Jungle Cruise would be on that list. The Thai Cave Rescue picture, which has not quite been released yet, is on that list. People like my sister don't like any of the horror films that I've been working on, or she's like, finally something I can go and see. My kids are 20 and 21, so they go and see all variety of different things. But when I was, when they were younger, a lot of the stuff I work on, I couldn't really show them, or I would just show them my part of it. But so it's good to know that you can. The Thai Cave picture will be something that everyone knows. Most people know the story, so I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that, and that would be good exposure for them, and it would be good for people to see what they've done with the story. Jungle Cruise, big summer blockbuster movie. When there's been a lineup of films we shot that film in September of 2018. We shot 3 years ago. By the time it's been just under. So it all depends on, Tully. I get a lot of comments on Tully because a lot of people either see it on a plane or they see it on demand or whatever. And it's such a, the sequence comes out of nowhere almost. And I thought for sure that film, they were going to cut it out, because you could almost cut it out and get away with it. But I'm glad they kept it in. So yeah, those kinds of films where there's not a lot of violence, and for sure, my kids and my sister and my wife will watch. My wife watches everything that I do. She's my biggest fan. But as far as her, going out and seeing these films, yeah, she'd probably go see Jungle Cruise, and for sure she'd see the Thai Cave film. But she probably wouldn't. I don't know if she'd go out of her way to go see Old if it didn't work on it. So
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. My wife and I, like, our relationship is kind of built on our mutual appreciation for the movie The Mummy from 1999. And so a lot of, you could say that there's this Jungle Cruise makes like a nice companion piece with that film, just with the story beats and everything like that. And so it has this grand sense of adventure. It's kind of playing with movie tropes, like classic movie tropes, in a very fun and energetic way. And so after my wife and I watched Jungle Cruise, we both were like, yeah, we're probably going to watch this quite a bit. This is probably going to be the movie that we watch the most this year, just because that's what we like, that kind of escapism. And I'm a big fan of Dwayne Johnson and Emily Blunt, and I like puns and dad jokes and things like that. So that's all my cup of tea. But yeah, Old, I couldn't convince her to watch that. I love that kind of stuff. So I'm the opposite of your sister. I like Cabin in the Woods and very dark material like that. But
typically, that's what I like. I mean, my favorite cinematographer was Robbie Mueller, who shot for Wim Wenders and Alex Cox and Jim Jarmusch. And, you know, that's, you know, and he's in my head, you know, before I roll the camera. He's part of those influences that I was talking about. You've got Andrew Wyeth, you've got Alex Colville, artists, and James Notway, combat photographers. You've got everybody that I absorb is all in there. But for sure, I like, you know, I usually, you know, I watch a lot of European cinema. I saw a lot of great pictures. I just finished doing a picture in Canada called Slumberland for Francis Lawrence, who I've worked with a couple times. And he's also one of a very few select people that I would like jump on a grenade for. Yeah. But yeah, I did a lot of foreign film watching on Amazon when I was holed up because of COVID, couldn't go anywhere or whatever. But you know, and it's like The Mummy. I remember when that movie came out because I really I was a big Jerry Goldsmith fan, and the score he did for that picture was spectacular. So and you know, sadly he's not around anymore. But yeah, we'll see. It's funny. I keep some of the people that I worked with on Slumberland. I did some work with Terrence Malick on this one sort of large format documentary film that he did. Mm-hmm. The name of which I'm going to have to look up. I can't remember the name, but he's like, oh, you know, the visual effects supervisor Adrian DeWitt. He was in a volcano with Malick and like 4 or 5 people. Yeah, and I was like, you know, like that's the stuff that really, those are the stories that I want to hear, not about, you know, well, this guy didn't show up on time or whatever. That stuff is far more interesting to me. So, but yeah, hopefully one day I can collaborate with Terrence Malick, but I don't know. We'll see. He's on a wish list of people that I'd like to collaborate with. But for sure, I like a darker or just a bit more interesting palette for my filmmaking, my film enjoyment anyway.